From the moment you step into a house like this, you can feel it, not in the floorboards or the wallpaper, but in the very air. There is a heaviness that presses against your chest, a quiet, suffocating awareness that you are intruding on something you were never meant to see. It smells faintly of old wood, mildew, and something else. Something that smells of memory, of lineage, of secrets that have been locked away for generations. Most families leave traces of themselves behind, photographs, letters, furniture. But this household was different. Its traces were darker, more insidious. Here, the past had not merely been preserved, it had been twisted, folded in on itself like a living thing that refuses to die. It is hard to imagine the origin of such a lineage. You can trace family trees back through decades, through centuries, but in this home, the tree does not grow outward. It curls inward into itself, looping in ways that defy natural order. To speak of this household is to speak of a bloodline that thrived not despite its isolation, but because of it. To speak of them is to touch the unspeakable, the families whose genetic histories were sealed behind closed doors, bound by both blood and silence. The earliest records that survive suggest a simple farmstead, somewhere tucked deep in the rural outskirts of Appalachia, a place where the land itself seemed to conspire with solitude. Generations lived and died without the intrusion of neighbors, strangers, or even visitors. But the more isolated they became, the more the family tightened its own coils. Marriage between cousins, uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters. It was not seen as scandalous within these walls. It was, in their own words, necessary. The necessity was survival, yes, but also control. By keeping their gene pool contained, they preserved not just property and wealth, but a lineage that would never be diluted, never contaminated by the outside world. You can imagine what this did to the children. To grow up in a household where the line between father and brother, mother and daughter, was blurred by obligation and secrecy. There are stories whispered by former neighbors, people who remember glimpses of the children walking in the fields, their faces strange and symmetrical in ways that unsettled the town. They were quiet, watchful, the product of generations of insularity. They learned early that the world beyond their fences was irrelevant, dangerous, even corrupting. In their minds, nothing outside mattered because they carried all that mattered inside their own blood. But genetic isolation carries a cost. Physical deformities, cognitive impairments, unpredictable bursts of violence. These symptoms were documented in the household, though always quietly, almost reverently, as if acknowledging them was a betrayal. One census taker noted, in passing, that the family rarely mingled with outsiders and several children appeared unusually frail or backward. That's the sort of understated horror that history often records, a line in a ledger that hides a lifetime of trauma, a generation lost in plain sight. The family didn't just survive. They did so with an almost unnatural cohesion, a unity forged in secrecy and fear. It's easy to dismiss such stories as folklore, the kind of myth that rural towns generate when they encounter something they cannot explain. But the evidence was there if you looked for it. Letters, diaries, old photographs, some hidden away in the rafters or buried in the soil of the backyard. They reveal a family obsessed with its own continuity, documenting births and deaths with a meticulousness that borders on mania. A father would write to a son about the proper care of livestock, but also about the purity of our line. An aunt would record her niece's milestones alongside observations of their similarities, not just in appearance but in temperament. There is a cold precision to these records, as if the family were aware of the precarious balance they were maintaining, the risk of deformity, of madness, of exposure to the outside world. The house itself became a character in this story. Dark, sprawling, with hallways that twist in ways that confuse the visitor. doors that lead to rooms filled with old furniture, trunks of letters, jars of specimens, things that hint at an obsession with permanence, with preservation. The walls seem to absorb the sound of conversation, and yet echo memories of arguments, laughter, and cries that no one outside could ever fully interpret. Children grew up knowing that the house was both protector and prison. Every corner contained lessons, warnings, punishments, or rewards, and all were tied back to the central doctrine: the family comes first, always. Even as the years passed, the family refused to let the outside in. Education came from within, a carefully curated curriculum designed not to expand their world view but to reinforce it. History was rewritten to serve their lineage. Science was consulted only insofar as it could improve the next generation, not to enlighten them. Morality was measured by loyalty, obedience, and the preservation of the bloodline. And yet, despite the control, cracks appeared. Children inevitably began to ask questions. Siblings wondered what life might be like beyond the fields and forests. Some even attempted escape, only to be brought back or kept under stricter watch. Fear was as much a tool as love, and often more effective. In the quietest moments, you can almost hear the weight of centuries pressing down. Every decision, every act of concealment or repetition was guided by the unseen hand of ancestry. They were haunted by themselves, by the inevitability of the patterns they had inherited, and by the knowledge that any deviation might unravel the fragile tapestry of their existence. Outside observers called it madness. Inside the house, it was survival, and so the family persisted, generation after generation, carrying within them the consequences of their choices. Genetic and emotional echoes intertwined in ways too complex for outsiders to fully grasp. Some family members became caretakers of the old traditions, obsessively documenting births, illnesses, and peculiarities. Others rebelled quietly, developing strange behaviors, compulsions, or isolated eccentricities that would later be cited as evidence of the cost of inbreeding. All of it was woven into the household's daily life, normal to them, horrifying to anyone else. This story is not just about grotesque curiosity or forbidden relationships. It is about the fragility of human society when subjected to extreme isolation and secrecy. It is about the ways in which love, fear, and obsession can become indistinguishable when generations are locked within the same walls. And it is about what happens when a family decides that its continuity is more important than the rules of nature or the well-being of its members. In the end, the house and its inhabitants left behind more than records. They left a warning, a glimpse into a world where humanity bends back on itself, where survival and horror are inseparable, where devotion becomes imprisonment, and where the line between family and something monstrous is nearly invisible. Every artifact, every diary entry, every photograph is a testament to the unnatural order they created, a dark mirror of what happens when blood becomes law and loyalty overrides conscience. Even today, when you research them, when you piece together the fragments left behind in archives, the sensation remains the same, that heaviness pressing against your chest, that almost audible whisper of history warning you not to look too closely. Because once you understand the depth of what happened here, there is no turning back. There is only the knowledge that somewhere in the shadows of American history, these stories were lived, endured, and hidden from the world, waiting for someone to uncover them, and perhaps feel the same chilling weight that those who lived it felt every single day. The story of this household does not remain abstract for long. Once you start peeling back the layers, the human cost becomes unavoidable. By the early 20th century, outsiders who stumbled across the family's property described an eerie, almost unnatural silence. Even the livestock seemed subdued, as if the isolation had spread beyond humans and infected the land itself. Children were rarely seen playing freely. If they appeared, it was in small, careful groups, moving as though their very steps were measured by invisible rules. Locals spoke of them in whispers, as though mentioning them aloud might summon the household from its shadowed existence. "Don't go down that road," one neighbor warned. "They don't belong to the world out here." What these neighbors could not know was the intensity of the household's internal world. Every decision revolved around controlling not just behavior, but destiny itself. Names, marriages, births, even deaths were meticulously orchestrated. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and the children were raised to accept these arrangements as natural, inevitable, and sacred. To question them was more than taboo, it was a form of treason. And yet, within the confines of this brutal, invisible law, individuals experienced all the normal pangs of human curiosity, rebellion, and longing. The psychological impact on the children is almost unimaginable. Imagine growing up in a world where every intimate relationship you see or participate in is predicated on blood, where love, desire, and familial duty are entwined in ways that twist your understanding of trust and intimacy. There are recorded accounts, private letters smuggled out by distant relatives, that speak of quiet terror and confusion among the younger generation. Some wrote of nightmares that blurred the lines between parent and sibling, child and guardian. Others described a pervasive shame, an instinctive knowledge that their family was fundamentally different from anyone else. And yet that difference was not something to escape. It was the air they breathed, the food they ate, the very rhythm of their lives. Even as modernity crept into the surrounding regions, the family remained stubbornly hidden, clinging to the ways of their forebears. They maintained small plots of farmland, keeping livestock and cultivating vegetables for sustenance. But the true obsession was the preservation of the line. Any intrusion from the outside, government officials, teachers, curious passers-by, was met with subtle hostility, veiled threats, or complete silence. Outsiders were tolerated only as long as they did not disrupt the fragile equilibrium inside. This equilibrium was enforced with a mixture of fear, tradition, and ritual. Daily life followed strict routines, but these routines were layered with unspoken rules. Children were trained early to recognize hierarchy, to obey without question, and to internalize the family's philosophy that loyalty to blood transcends all else. This was not merely discipline, it was indoctrination. The household's elders maintained an almost religious authority, speaking rarely, but with a weight that could not be ignored. They were keepers of both knowledge and consequence. To step out of line was to risk the silent but unmistakable wrath of the family, ostracism, isolation, or worse. And yet, despite the strict control, cracks inevitably appeared. Adolescents who sensed the strangeness of their upbringing often tried to flee, if only temporarily. Some left letters behind, scraps of confession and rebellion, describing a desire for freedom they could barely imagine. Others returned, beaten by circumstance or guilt, only to be reintegrated into the household with renewed vigilance. These stories suggest a dual reality, one of terror and oppression, yes, but also of a strange attachment, a gravitational pull toward the very people who had constrained them. The family was a cage, but it was also home, and for many, leaving it entirely was an impossibility. By the mid-20th century, the consequences of sustained inbreeding became evident in more than just psychological terms. Physical deformities appeared with increasing frequency: cleft palates, shortened limbs, unusual facial features, and cognitive challenges that were chronicled quietly by visiting doctors. These medical observations were rarely published or discussed publicly. Any formal acknowledgement could have invited intervention from authorities, and the family's obsessive secrecy made such exposure extremely rare. The pattern of repetition was unmistakable, however. Bloodlines folded inward over and over, producing a living archive of genetic isolation. Yet, there was also a peculiar resilience. Despite these challenges, members of the household survived, reproduced, and maintained an almost feral adaptability. Their skills were practical, honed in isolation: hunting, farming, carpentry, herbal medicine. But even these abilities carried the imprint of their strange upbringing. Some children displayed unusual strength or endurance, perhaps a side effect of rigorous, unrelenting routines. Others developed uncanny social acuity, learning to read subtle expressions, control temperaments, and anticipate the needs of both elders and siblings. They became experts in survival, but survival of a very particular, very constrained type, one that demanded self-containment and a suppression of individual impulses for the sake of collective continuity. By now, outsiders who had any contact with the family often left with an indelible impression of unease. Their speech, their posture, their very presence felt alien. Even casual acquaintances reported moments of discomfort, seeing a child stare too long, or noticing how siblings interacted with a familiarity that felt unsettling. Psychological horror here is subtle, slow, cumulative. It isn't the grotesque alone that shocks, it's the quiet certainty that something is fundamentally wrong, and that wrongness is intimately, heartbreakingly human. It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of emotional damage that a lineage like this produces. Each generation inherits not just genes, but trauma, secrecy, and the weight of expectation. Children learn to hide thoughts, desires, and emotions. Adolescents learn that curiosity is dangerous. Adults often emerge from this crucible with strange loyalties, skewed perceptions of intimacy, and an almost pathological need for control. There are reports of obsessive tendencies, compulsions, and self-destructive behaviors that echo the unnatural patterns of the household. In essence, the family becomes both subject and object of its own experiment, a living study in isolation and inherited consequence. And yet, there are moments of human tenderness, fleeting, almost imperceptible. Siblings who protect one another from harsh reprimands, parents who show affection in subtle, coded ways, children who cling to rituals as a form of comfort. These glimpses make the overall horror more poignant, not less. They remind us that within even the most unnatural systems of control, humanity struggles to survive. But such moments are dangerous. They disrupt the hierarchy, risk exposure, and must be carefully managed. Even love becomes another tool, another means of enforcing the family's unnatural order. As history advanced, the family's isolation became more pronounced. They refused schooling outside the home, limited travel, and avoided public records whenever possible. Newspapers that mentioned them did so only in passing, often in oblique, coded language. Local family keeps to themselves was the most common description, hiding an undercurrent of suspicion, fear, and fascination. It was a household that existed both physically and in the imagination of outsiders, its horror amplified by the imagination of those who could only guess at what occurred behind locked doors. It is here, in this second layer of the story, that we begin to confront a reality almost too disturbing to face. The combination of secrecy, isolation, and genetic repetition produces a feedback loop, a psychological echo chamber where the horrors of past generations are inherited alongside the blood. Decisions that may have seemed pragmatic to the elders, the marriages, the insistence on lineage, the control over education, have consequences that ripple outward, fracturing minds and bodies across decades. The family's history becomes a living document of human endurance and human suffering, inseparable and indistinguishable. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the time the latter half of the 20th century arrived, investigators and curious journalists began to piece together fragments of the household's history. Old letters, photographs, and land records revealed a picture of staggering consistency. Generations married within the same small circle, children bore the marks of repeated union, and the family maintained an almost obsessive record of births, deaths, and peculiar behaviors. Every revelation only confirmed what many had suspected, that the household was an extreme example of human isolation, obsession, and endurance. And yet, despite all the accumulated knowledge, the most intimate details remain elusive. Diaries are incomplete, letters lost, memories obscured by shame and secrecy. For every piece of evidence uncovered, there is a gap that can only be filled with speculation, and the imagination of those gaps is where the true horror lies. Because we know with absolute certainty that somewhere within those walls, countless lives were shaped, constrained, and scarred by forces that no outsider could truly understand. By the time the late 20th century arrived, the house, the family, and their twisted traditions were no longer merely an oddity. They had become a kind of living archive of human extremity. Generations of repeated unions had created a web of interconnections so dense it was almost impossible to untangle. Surnames were irrelevant here. Everyone carried pieces of everyone else, fragments of their genetic past encoded in ways that could neither be escaped nor ignored. Visitors, scholars, or casual researchers attempting to trace the line quickly found themselves confronted with a dizzying tangle of relationships, an intimate maze where uncle could be cousin, sister could be mother, and child could carry the genetic imprint of multiple roles at once. Walking through the house, or imagining it, is to step into a space where every object, every photograph, every note bears witness. There are diaries in hidden drawers, some written in childish hand, recounting what should have been innocent milestones with an eerie awareness of the unnatural order. Births are catalogued alongside warnings, instructions, or reminders. A father might note casually that a daughter resembles a niece more than her mother, and add a calculation, almost clinical, about what it means for the family line. The records are at once mundane and horrifying, a daily accounting of human lives subjected to the rigorous logic of preservation above all else. And yet, despite the unnatural circumstances, the family survived, and in some ways thrived. Survival, here, does not mean happiness. It does not mean fulfillment. It does not mean freedom. It means endurance. Children grew into adults who were intimately skilled at navigating the labyrinth of relationships and hierarchy that defined the household. They could anticipate the moods of elders, the whims of siblings, and the expectations of distant cousins with a precision that bordered on instinct. These skills, honed over generations, were often coupled with strange eccentricities, compulsions, and a heightened sensitivity to the smallest deviations from the family's invisible code. In the wrong hands, they might seem supernatural. In reality, they were simply the consequence of extreme, unrelenting isolation. But the house also created ghosts of another kind. Stories of violence, neglect, and despair are scattered throughout the historical record, often oblique, sometimes veiled in euphemism, but unmistakable to the attentive eye. Accounts from former residents, rescued letters, and law enforcement reports hint at punishments that were both psychological and physical. Children were disciplined for curiosity, for questioning, for exhibiting traits deemed undesirable in the family line. At times, elders would employ isolation as a tool, confining rebellious members to attic rooms or locked spaces for weeks at a time. These measures, terrifying to the outsider, were considered normal, even necessary, by those who enforced them. And yet, in this horror, there was an almost ritualistic beauty, a terrifying symmetry that cannot be ignored. Each generation mirrored the last, echoing the same triumphs and failures, joys and cruelties, in patterns so precise they bordered on inevitability. Birth, marriage, and death were all governed by the same invisible law, the survival and purity of the bloodline above all else. In this sense, the household becomes less a home and more a machine, a darkly efficient organism devoted to one singular purpose. Human emotion exists, yes, but it is always secondary to the machinery of lineage. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this story is the way the outside world is simultaneously excluded and implicated. The family's secrecy created an impermeable bubble, but that bubble exists in a society that largely ignored it until the damage became undeniable. There are moments when letters or diaries reference outsiders in almost obsessive detail. Curious neighbors, visiting officials, distant relatives. Each encounter is measured and categorized, each interaction assessed for potential threat or contamination. Outsiders were both feared and fascinating, a constant reminder of a world that the family had chosen to reject, yet could never fully escape. The psychological landscape of the family is impossible to convey fully. Imagine generations growing up with the knowledge that every choice, every act, every emotion is scrutinized through the lens of survival and purity. Children are taught to conceal desire, to suppress curiosity, to obey without question. Adolescents experience conflict between instinctual drives and the strict demands of hierarchy. Adults live with inherited guilt and fear, and yet often demonstrate fierce, protective loyalty to the same structures that constrained them. Love is present, but it is filtered, mediated, and almost always conditional. It is never free. As time moves forward, the family's shadow extends further, beyond the house itself. Genetic traits, both physical and mental, echo outward, carried by those who leave, who rebel, or who are exiled. Drama, secrecy, and unusual behaviors ripple across the generations. Psychologists today would likely describe it as multigenerational trauma, an inherited response to extreme conditions of isolation, fear, and rigid control. But to the family, it was just life, the only life they had ever known. And then there are the moments that defy explanation entirely. Reports speak of family members vanishing for days or weeks, only to return with stories that make outsiders shiver. There are hints of clandestine rituals, nocturnal gatherings, and obscure traditions that are never fully documented. Photographs occasionally show gatherings where children sit unusually close to parents or siblings, their faces nearly identical, their expressions almost disturbingly synchronized. These images, innocuous at first glance, take on a darker significance when understood in context. They are the visual echoes of a family repeating patterns that should not be repeated, living out cycles that are almost impossible to escape. The final layer of horror lies in the cumulative knowledge of what this household represents. We are not merely observing eccentricity or misfortune. We are observing an extreme case of human isolation, obsession, and inherited consequence. Every decision, every union, every act of control has created a living archive of unnatural human behavior. The family is at once a testament to resilience and a monument to suffering. It reminds us that, under certain conditions, loyalty, fear, love, and obsession can become indistinguishable. It reminds us that blood can bind in ways that reason cannot undo. By now, the household is largely a relic. The older generations have passed. The house stands as a shadowed reminder of what once was, and some members have moved beyond its walls, carrying both the gifts and the curses of their lineage. Yet the story is not simply about a house or a family. It is about the human capacity for secrecy, endurance, and horror. It is about the dangers of isolation, the consequences of obsessive preservation, and the haunting power of history repeating itself. We are left with fragments, diaries, photographs, letters, and accounts that can never fully convey the experience of living within this household. They are fragments of terror, devotion, and unnatural continuity, pieced together like shards of glass reflecting a distorted reality. To study them is to confront questions most of us could never face. How far would you go to preserve your family? What would you sacrifice? How much horror can one generation inherit from the last? And as we look back across decades, we realize that the most frightening aspect is not the deformities, the secrecy, or even the forbidden relationships themselves. It is the ordinary humanity of those caught within this world, the children who laughed, cried, and loved under impossible constraints, the parents who believed in the sanctity of their choices, the siblings who depended on each other for survival, even when it came at unimaginable cost. They were human, and that is why it is so terrifying. Because once you understand their story, once you trace the threads of their lives, there is no escaping the realization, hidden in the quiet corners of history, buried beneath the surface of ordinary American life, there exist lineages and households that test the limits of our understanding of morality, family, and survival. Theirs is a darkness that lingers not just in records, but in the human imagination itself. To confront it is to confront what we might call the ultimate truth, that sometimes the most terrifying horrors are not monsters or myths, but the quiet, enduring consequences of human choices, repeated across generations, locked away in the homes and hearts of those who dared to defy the world. In the name of blood, and in the silence that follows, in the echo of the empty hallways, in the weight of the unspoken history, you can almost hear them. Not just the whispers of the past, but the pulse of something that refuses to die. A lineage insular and obsessive, stretching back through centuries, preserved in flesh, memory, and shadow. A household that history almost forgot, and we are left to wonder whether it ever truly will.